Most people understand betrayal as a personal event, a wrong decision, a desire that crossed a boundary, a selfish moment that can be explained by circumstances, emotions, or immaturity. That interpretation is only accurate when the one being betrayed is an ordinary individual, someone who exists in the relationship as an equal, self-contained role. When the one betrayed is a super empath, that entire framework collapses, because a super empath does not enter a relationship merely as an independent individual. They enter as a living structure, an invisible system that organizes and stabilizes the entire emotional field the relationship depends on in order to exist. The greatest illusion held by those who betray a super empath lies here. They believe they are leaving a person, when in reality they are stepping off a foundation. In Carl Jung's depth psychology, there are individuals who do not participate in relationships through persona alone, but through the full capacity of their unconscious. Super empaths are such individuals. They do not only respond to what is spoken, they perceive what has never been named. They do not merely process emotions as they arise, they regulate latent conflicts before they ever erupt. Their presence creates an order that others gradually take for granted, as if it had always existed on its own. For this reason, when betrayal occurs, the super empath is not the only one who is wounded. The entire structure that depends on them begins to destabilize, even if the betrayer has not yet realized it. This is why betraying a super empath never truly ends at the moment of discovery or separation. It initiates a prolonged chain of consequences, because what has been damaged is not a fleeting emotional bond, but a psychological role that existed long enough to become the backbone of the relationship. Super empaths do not control through power, nor do they bind others through fear or obligation. Their power lies in preventing chaos from spreading. They sense misalignment before it becomes conflict, feel instability before it is named as a problem. In Jungian terms, individuals like this often carry an unconscious function that the other person either lacks or is unwilling to develop: the capacity to contain the shadow. A super empath is deep enough to stand beside another's disowned parts without abandoning themselves. And this is precisely what creates a dangerous illusion for the betrayer, the illusion that everything will be fine because they will always be there. This illusion makes betrayal easier. If you believe someone will always be there to maintain order, you gradually permit yourself to break that order, not because you intend cruelty, but because you have never fully realized that you are being held. This is the first psychological blind spot in every story of betraying a super empath. The betrayer does not know they are living within a structure sustained by another. And when you do not know you are being supported, you assume you are standing on your own. In this context, betrayal is neither rebellion nor the free choice many imagine it to be. It is the consequence of living too long within an order that was provided without cost. Super empaths do not demand recognition for their role. They simply do what is necessary to prevent the system from collapsing. But that very silence renders their role invisible. And when an invisible role is broken, the collapse arrives later, deeper, and far more violently. At the moment of betrayal, the betrayer often feels in control. They believe they are exiting a relationship, opening a new possibility, choosing a different path. What they fail to see is that this sense of control exists only at the level of behavior, not at the level of structure. The structure the super empath maintained does not vanish the moment betrayal occurs. It begins to withdraw slowly and silently, exactly the way it once existed. And this is the most important point of this section. Betraying a super empath does not produce immediate consequences. It produces psychological delay. During that delay, the betrayer may still feel fine and relieved. Everything appears to function. Yet in reality, the system has already begun to destabilize from within. What was once contained starts to leak. What was once softened grows sharp. What was once organized slips into disorder. At this stage, the super empath often has not fully withdrawn yet. They are experiencing a cognitive shock. How could someone who was held so completely betray? But that very shock marks the beginning of transformation. Because when the super empath stops questioning behavior and begins questioning structure, how much they carried, how long they held it, and why betrayal is no longer merely an external event, it becomes an internal signal. And when that signal is correctly understood, the illusion dissolves. Not the illusion about the other person, but the illusion about the super empath's own role in the relationship. From here, everything prepares to enter a different phase, a phase in which the super empath begins to see the entire system clearly, while the betrayer begins to live inside an order that is quietly, irreversibly withdrawing. Part 1: Super Empath, a rare psychological structure, not a kind personality. The most common mistake when speaking about a super empath is confusing them with a person who has a vulnerable or overly sensitive personality. This label is not only inaccurate, it fundamentally distorts the nature of the phenomenon. A super empath is not someone who feels more than average. They are someone who processes feeling in a way most people cannot. Their core difference does not lie in emotional intensity, but in an internal structure strong enough to receive, hold, and reorganize what others cannot contain within themselves. In-depth psychology, not everyone has the capacity to contain. Most people respond to emotion by discharging it, avoiding it, projecting it, or going numb. A super empath is different. They can remain present with another person's unprocessed emotions without needing to expel them immediately. This requires an ego that is stable enough, differentiated enough, and internally bounded enough not to dissolve. In other words, a super empath is not weak, they are highly load-bearing. Carl Jung described individuals who can come into contact with another person's shadow without panic as those who have developed an early capacity to distinguish between the self and what is occurring within the psychological field. Super empaths often develop this structure very early, not because they were raised in safety, but because they were forced to become the ones who provided safety. Many super empaths grow up in environments where emotions were unnamed, conflicts unresolved, and stability was not a given. To survive, they learn to read space, read nuance, read what was never spoken, and most importantly, they learned how to keep things from falling apart. This process creates the super empath's greatest strength, the ability to maintain inner order while standing inside chaos. They do not need to control others to feel safe. They generate safety through their presence. This makes them an exceptionally strong psychological anchor in complex relationships. People around a super empath often feel that everything is easier. I feel understood, or things seem more okay when they're here, even if no one can explain why. But this strength carries a hidden consequence. The super empath's role is easily rendered invisible, because they do not create order through authority or dominance, but through subtle regulation. When a system runs smoothly for long enough, people begin to believe it runs on its own. Few stop to ask, who is holding everything together? Who is absorbing the tension? Who is softening what would otherwise be unbearable? A super empath does not need to be thanked to continue fulfilling this role, because they are not motivated by reward. They act because their internal structure does not allow them to turn away from disorder when they have the capacity to hold it. But this very quality makes them vulnerable to relationships where imbalance becomes the new normal, not because they fail to notice it, but because they can endure it longer. Another rarely discussed strength of the super empath is their ability to recognize truth before it is articulated. They sense misalignment, falseness, and inconsistency between words and behavior. Yet, instead of exposing it immediately, they often choose to hold it, observe, and allow time. Not because they are naive, but because they understand that truth only has value when the system is ready to receive it. This is a crucial difference between a super empath and someone who is merely blunt. A super empath does not speak everything they see. They speak only when it serves stability. This capacity often leads others to misinterpret them as someone who puts up with too much, when in reality they are assessing structure. But when that structure continuously relies on them to survive without any corresponding movement toward growth, a threshold forms. This threshold is not loud and not announced, but it exists. And betrayal is often the trigger that pushes that threshold past its limit. What matters here is this: a super empath does not attach out of dependency. They attach because they perceive their role within the system. When that role is violated at its core, not through conflict, but through betrayal, their internal structure reorganizes immediately. They do not react impulsively, they reposition. And once a super empath repositions, they do not return to their former place. Most outsiders never notice this moment because it is not dramatic. A super empath does not need to create a scene to withdraw. They simply stop performing the micro adjustments they once made instinctively. And when those adjustments stop, the system begins to reveal the truth about itself. What was once held by their capacity must now stand on its own, and often it cannot. Therefore, when speaking about a super empath, the emphasis should not be on kindness or sacrifice, but on structural capacity. They carry the ability to create order without domination, safety without control, and connection without losing the self. This is why betraying them is never a normal act. It strikes the center of a system that has been operating in silence for far too long. Part 2: Why the narcissist is drawn to the super empath. Not love, but psychological survival. A narcissist is not drawn to a super empath because they are especially kind, nor because they give more than others. This attraction is not romantic in nature, it is psychological survival. At the deepest level, the narcissist is not seeking a relationship. They are seeking a stabilizing mechanism for an internal structure that cannot stand on its own. And the super empath, by virtue of a structure formed long ago, becomes the perfect answer to that need. In depth psychology, a narcissist is not someone who loves themselves too much, but someone with an empty self that must be maintained from the outside. Inside, there is no stable center capable of emotional self-regulation, self-soothing, or self-validation. As a result, they must seek individuals who can perform these functions for them. Not everyone can. Only those who can hold, endure, and organize emotion at a deep level can sustain a narcissist's sense of being okay over time. And the super empath is one of the rare individuals who can do this. Crucially, this attraction occurs before conscious awareness. The narcissist does not need to understand who the super empath is in order to be drawn to them. Their body and nervous system recognize it first. In the presence of a super empath, the narcissist feels less chaotic, less tense, less disorganized, not because the super empath is doing something specific, but because their presence creates order. For the narcissist, this sensation is often misinterpreted as connection, destiny, or intense love. The reality, however, is that the narcissist does not love the super empath as an independent subject. They attach to the function the super empath is unconsciously performing. This is the greatest blind spot of the early stage of the relationship. The narcissist believes they have found someone special, when in fact they have found an optimal emotional regulation source. And the super empath, with their tendency to see potential and deep structure in others, often misreads this attachment as a relationship with developmental possibility. At this stage, things often run relatively smoothly. The super empath sets the rhythm, softens, explains, connects, and creates meaning. The narcissist feels better, clearer, even more mature. But this improvement does not come from the narcissist's inner resources. It comes from borrowing the super-empath structure. This is why narcissists often feel fine with an empath beside them and deeply unstable when alone. This dependency is not experienced by the narcissist as dependency. It is disguised as confidence, power, and control. But the more dependent they become, the more they fear loss. And that fear gradually transforms into manipulation, boundary testing, and ultimately betrayal. Not because the narcissist wants to leave, but because they need to assert power in the face of their own unconscious dependence. At a deeper level, betrayal is a misguided attempt to prove, I don't need you. The narcissist needs to believe they can still control, still leave, still survive intact. Yet this very act of betrayal is what initiates the real loss of control. Because when the super-empath recognizes that the relationship is not a meeting of two mature subjects, but a one-sided structure built on carrying, they begin to withdraw from the role they once held. What the narcissist does not anticipate is this. They do not lose the empath immediately. They lose the system. The super-empath does not sever ties dramatically. They simply stop regulating. They stop absorbing tension. Stop explaining on behalf of the other. Stop softening what is not their responsibility. These behaviors were once too subtle to notice, but when they disappear, the narcissist is forced, for the first time, to confront their unmediated internal state. At that point, the attraction reverses. The narcissist no longer feels connection, but panic. Not because they have lost love, but because they have lost their psychological anchor. They begin trying to pull the super-empath back, not to repair the relationship, but to restore the lost stability. This is why post-betrayal hoovering often feels urgent, contradictory, and inconsistent. The narcissist is reacting to inner collapse, not longing. The super-empath, at this stage, begins to see clearly what they once only sensed. The relationship existed not because two people were growing together, but because one person was preventing the other from falling apart. And once this truth is fully seen, the old structure can no longer continue to operate. The next section will examine the invisible contract that forms between the super-empath and the narcissist. A contract never spoken, yet governing the entire dynamic of power, betrayal, and the collapse that follows. Part 3. The invisible contract, an agreement that is never spoken. There is never a moment when the super-empath and the narcissist sit down to negotiate their roles. Yet from very early on, an invisible contract is established. This contract does not exist in language or conscious agreement. It exists at the deeper level of behavior and reflex. The super-empath becomes the one who maintains order, while the narcissist becomes the one who is held. No one declares this arrangement, but every interaction revolves around this structure. This invisible contract operates according to a logic that is simple yet profoundly dangerous. The super-empath assumes responsibility for the emotional stability of the entire system, while the narcissist retains the freedom to disrupt without bearing immediate consequences. The super-empath does this not because they are forced to, but because their internal structure is accustomed to intervening before collapse occurs. The narcissist, by contrast, is unaware that they are emotionally insured. They simply experience a constant sense of space to express, discharge, test boundaries, and even inflict harm while the system continues to hold. Over time, this contract creates a severe misalignment of responsibility. The super-empath carries what is invisible, unspoken tension, conflicts that never fully erupt, emotions that remain unprocessed. The narcissist carries what is visible, decisions, actions, surface-level choices. From the outside, the narcissist appears proactive, strong, even in control, but internally, everything stands only because someone else is continuously regulating the system behind the scenes. This invisible contract also explains why the narcissist becomes increasingly bold. When a system does not collapse after early tests, people begin to believe it cannot collapse at all. The narcissist gradually assumes they have the right to go further, speak more harshly, and cross deeper boundaries, not because they intend to destroy the relationship, but because they have grown accustomed to not paying the price immediately. Meanwhile, the super-empath is required to make ever more adjustments to compensate for the growing imbalance. The critical point of this invisible contract is this: it exists only as long as the super-empath continues to fulfill their role. The narcissist does not maintain the contract through conscious will. They maintain it through unconscious dependence. And the super-empath does not maintain it through commitment. They maintain it through load-bearing capacity. This makes the contract extraordinarily fragile. The moment the super-empath stops holding, the entire structure loses validity. Betrayal is the moment this contract is broken at its root, not because betrayal is morally extreme, but because it sends a clear structural signal. The super-empath's role is no longer respected as a foundational pillar. When this signal is received at a deep level, the super-empath does not need to argue, explain, or issue ultimatums. They need to do only one thing: stop maintaining the system. What the narcissist fails to understand is this: they never entered into a verbal contract with the super-empath, and therefore they cannot renegotiate it through words. Apologies, promises, or justifications do not reach the level at which the contract was formed, because this contract is not based on personal trust, but on functional allocation. And once the super-empath no longer accepts that function, every attempt to preserve the old structure becomes meaningless. From the moment the invisible contract collapses, the narcissist enters a paradox. They still believe they are in a relationship that can be repaired, while in reality they have already lost the condition that allowed the relationship to exist at all. The super-empath does not leave in the conventional sense. They simply no longer occupy the same position. Yet that shift alone renders the system incapable of operating as before, regardless of whether contact continues. The invisible contract also explains why super-empaths often do not leave immediately after betrayal. They need time to recognize that their role has not merely been hurt, but structurally exploited. Once this realization is complete, withdrawal is no longer an emotional reaction, but an ego-level reorganization. And when a decision is made at that level, it does not reverse. From here, the relationship enters its most dangerous phase. The narcissist continues to behave as though the contract is still in effect, while the super-empath has quietly withdrawn from it. This misalignment produces reactions the narcissist cannot comprehend. The super-empath becomes quieter, regulates less, explains less, and intervenes far less. What once was repaired immediately is now left alone to reveal itself. Part 4. The activation moment, when the super-empath stops enduring and begins to see. Betrayal is not the moment the super-empath hurts the most. It is the moment they become the clearest. This is often misunderstood, because from the outside, betrayal appears to be an emotional shock. But at a deeper level, for the super-empath, betrayal does not strike emotion first. It strikes structural awareness. It is the moment they stop asking, "Why did this person do this?" and begin asking, "What have I been holding for them all these years?" The activation moment is not loud. It does not come with shouting, tears, or impulsive decisions. On the contrary, it often arrives cold, a detail that cannot be justified, a behavior too clear to continue interpreting with goodwill, a point at which intuition no longer allows the super-empath to deceive themselves. And once that point is crossed, the entire internal system begins to reorganize. The first thing that happens is not anger, but withdrawal of intervention. The super empath suddenly sees that any attempt to repair at this stage no longer serves healing, but merely sustains a structure that has lost its foundation. They see clearly. If they continue to hold, they will continue to shield a system that has no intention of standing on its own. And once this awareness appears, the old role loses its moral legitimacy. This is the point many narcissists completely fail to understand. They assume betrayal will cause pain, pain will lead to conflict, and conflict will eventually lead to reconciliation through a familiar script. But the super empath does not operate within that cycle. Once structure becomes visible, emotion no longer governs decision-making. Truth does, and that truth is simple: their role has been misused. From the activation moment onward, the super empath begins to reclaim what they once gave unconditionally, not through declarations, but through micro-behaviors. They explain less, regulate less, soften less, and step in to mediate far less. These changes are subtle, so subtle that the narcissist often does not notice at first. Yet it is precisely the absence of these micro-adjustments that causes the system to reveal its true form. Another critical shift occurs within the super empath. They stop questioning their own worth. Before, they might have asked, "Did I do enough? Could I understand more? Am I overreacting?" After the activation moment, these questions disappear. Not because they become cold, but because responsibility has been correctly reassigned. They recognize that their part was completed long ago. This moment also marks the end of a deep illusion, the belief that enough patience and understanding will eventually lead to mutual growth. The super empath does not lose faith in humanity. They lose faith in this specific structure. And once faith is withdrawn from the correct place, it does not return through apologies or promises. Psychologically, the activation moment is the point at which the super empath shifts from outward directed empathy to inward directed self-awareness. They begin reviewing the entire history of interaction, not to assign blame, but to understand how much they carried that was never theirs to hold. This process is one of ego reclamation, and once it begins, it does not stop halfway. What makes the activation moment irreversible is that it is not based on transient emotion, but on the convergence of many signals that were delayed for too long. Betrayal is merely the final catalyst. When it occurs, all the pieces lock into place at once. And when the full picture appears, the super empath no longer has any reason to doubt their intuition. From the outside, the narcissist may see the super empath as still there, not gone, not cut off. But at a deeper level, the relationship has already entered a different phase. The super empath is no longer investing to keep the system alive. They are simply completing the process of awareness necessary to withdraw fully. And that withdrawal, once it happens, has no return path. Part 5, when the stabilizing axis disappears, the narcissist's inner chaos begins. A narcissist's collapse does not begin with missing you, and it does not begin with regret. It begins with a state they have no language to name, a loss of regulatory force. Before they even realize that the super empath has withdrawn from the role of maintaining order, their inner system has already started reacting. But this reaction does not resemble ordinary grief. It is like a room that was once temperature controlled, suddenly losing power. Nothing collapses instantly, but the temperature begins sliding out of the safe range. The first thing the narcissist feels is not, "I lost them," but something in me is no longer sitting in the right place. They start feeling irritated without knowing why. Small stimuli become overwhelming. Situations that used to be manageable become suffocating. They become more easily agitated, more exhausted, more empty. But instead of linking this state to the absence of the regulating function the super empath once carried, They interpret it as an external problem. Other people are annoying, circumstances are unfair, the world does not understand them. This is the most dangerous stage, because the narcissist still believes they are in control. They are not panicking yet, they simply feel off. And because a narcissist does not habitually look inward to process emotion, they try to restore control through behavior, becoming busier, chasing new stimulation, pursuing new people, creating new drama. But these efforts only cover the surface. They do not touch the core. The core is this. The super empath once functioned as an unconscious filter, not through words, but through presence. Unnamed tensions, unresolved conflicts, excessive ego impulses, everything was softened before it could become a crisis. When that filter disappears, everything that was never resolved returns to its original owner with greater intensity. The narcissist is not accustomed to this. They do not possess deep emotional self-regulation skills. They are used to projecting emotion outward, so they do not have to contain it. But when there is no longer someone willing to absorb or neutralize those projections, the projections rebound, and for the first time, the narcissist is forced to face themselves without an adjusting mirror. This creates a very specific sensation, being invaded by their own inner life. Unstable thoughts become more frequent, confidence becomes fragile. They may find themselves swinging between exhilaration and emptiness within the same day. Not because they miss the super empath in an emotional sense, but because their nervous system is becoming dysregulated without understanding why. At this stage, the narcissist often begins rewriting the story. They tell themselves that the super empath changed, became cold, isn't like they used to be. This story is not meant to describe reality. It is meant to protect the ego from a more dangerous realization that they had been dependent on something they cannot admit. Admitting that dependence would collapse the image of self-sufficiency the narcissist needs in order to survive. At the same time, another process unfolds quietly: the erosion of the persona. The narcissist's persona is built to function smoothly in social interaction. It requires feedback, mirrors, confirmation. When the super empath withdraws, a large portion of the subtle feedback the narcissist once received disappears. The persona begins to perform less effectively. Old tactics stop producing the same results. Performative confidence begins to crack. The narcissist may respond by increasing intensity, talking more, displaying more, manipulating more, but this is a sign of imbalance, not strength. A stable system does not need to raise its volume in order to exist. The fact that the narcissist has to do more just to feel okay shows they are losing their foundation. Another undernoticed consequence is a shift in their sense of time. When the super empath was present, the narcissist often felt that everything was happening, moving forward. When the stabilizing axis disappears, time starts to feel empty. Days feel longer, new relationships lack depth, and every interaction feels shallow and quickly exhausting. This is not because the world has become worse, but because they have lost the capacity for sustained bonding that they previously borrowed from the super empath. At this stage, the narcissist often begins to feel unsettled without calling it unsettled. They may return to the super empath not with a deep apology, but with ambiguous signals, a message, a memory cue, a reaction check. Not because they want to repair the structure, but because they want to see whether the old stabilizing axis still works. And if the super empath no longer responds as before, the narcissist's insecurity escalates rapidly. What matters most is this: the narcissist does not collapse because they were abandoned, but because they are forced to self-regulate for the first time. This is a task beyond the capacity of an inner structure that has relied on others for too long in order to avoid it. And because they have no internal tools to process what is happening, they fall into a loop. Stimulation, emptiness, stimulation, emptiness. This chaos does not always show on the outside. Some narcissists become busier, even more successful on the surface. But internally, stability does not return, because what they lost is not a specific person, but a function they cannot reproduce on their own. Meanwhile, the super empath does not need to do anything else. Their withdrawal is enough for the system to reveal its truth. Not because the super empath is punishing, but because they have stopped shielding. And when shielding disappears, truth does not need to be exposed. It simply becomes visible. Part 6. Ego restructuring. When the super empath stops being the holder and becomes a subject, the super empath's withdrawal is not an emotional act, but a structural shift. After the activation moment, they do not leave in the usual sense. They enter a phase in which their entire inner system must be reorganized from the ground up. Because when someone has lived too long in the role of holding order for others, stopping that holding is not merely a change in behavior, it requires an ego restructuring. The first thing the super empath faces is not freedom, but emptiness. A very specific emptiness. No crisis, no drama, but also no familiar noise of having to intervene, adjust, repair. This emptiness is often mistaken for loneliness, but in truth it is the absence of a role. And because that role once consumed a large portion of their life energy, its absence creates a sense of strangeness, sometimes even temporary disorientation. In this stage, the super empath begins to recognize an uncomfortable truth. Many of their previous connections were not built on the meeting of two mature subjects, but on the function they provided. When that function disappears, those relationships fall away on their own. No severing is necessary. No conflict is required. They simply lose their reason to exist. This is one of the most powerful purification phases because it forces the super empath to see that they were often needed more than they were truly seen. Ego restructuring begins when the super empath stops asking, "How am I useful to others?" and starts asking, "What is true for me?" This question may sound simple, but for a super empath, it is revolutionary. Because in the past, their sense of value was often felt through the impact they had on other people's states. When that axis is removed, they must learn to locate value without relying on anyone else's reaction. A major shift happens here. The super empath begins to clearly distinguish between empathy and dissolution. Before, they could feel another person's pain to the point of treating it as their responsibility. After this process, they still feel often even more sharply, but they no longer enter the role of fixing it for someone else. Empathy no longer automatically produces action. It becomes a chosen capacity, not a compulsory reflex. This shift leads to the establishment of a new kind of boundary, not a defensive boundary, but an ontological one. The super empath does not need to explain their boundaries to be understood. They simply live from a newly restructured center. What does not fit is naturally pushed out of orbit. What does fit is naturally kept. No tension, no force. This is the clearest sign that restructuring is nearing completion. At this stage, the super empath often experiences a kind of peace that is fundamentally different from before. It does not come from the world around them being calm, but from no longer being responsible for another person's chaos. This peace is not exciting and not dramatic, but it is extremely stable. And once they have tasted this state, they cannot return to the old role without feeling as though they are betraying themselves. A deeper consequence of restructuring is a shift in how the super empath understands strength. Before, their strength lay in endurance, adaptation, and preventing collapse. After transformation, their strength lies in refusing to participate in distorted structures. They understand that not everything needs to be saved, not everyone needs to be held, and not every relationship deserves their energy. This makes the super empath appear less accessible, not because they are cold, but because they no longer broadcast the signal that they are available to carry others. Those who were drawn to them for emotional regulation begin to feel the mismatch. Meanwhile, new relationships appear with a different quality, less dramatic, less dependent, but deeper and more real. This change is often misread by outsiders. Some claim the super empath changed, hardened, isn't who they used to be. But the truth is, they have returned to the correct position. The earlier version was not their true nature. It was their nature stretched beyond its limits to compensate for another person's deficiency. The current version is their stable form when they are not being forced to function as a supporting pillar. A key point of Part 7 is this: the super empath's restructuring is permanent, not because they are clinging to pain, but because they have updated their internal map. Once you have seen how a system operates and how you were pulled into the role of holding it, you cannot unsee it. And when you no longer unconsciously step into that role, the entire old dynamic loses its power. From this point on, the super empath does not need to close their heart to protect themselves. On the contrary, they become clearer in love. They no longer seek connection by filling someone else's emptiness. They seek a meeting between two subjects who can stand on their own. And if that meeting does not exist, they are willing to be alone without feeling deprived. Part 7, an unerasable trace. Why the narcissist becomes obsessed after the super empath leaves. What makes the narcissist unable to let go of the super empath is not love nor regret in the ordinary sense. It is something far deeper, the loss of a structure that once prevented their ego from collapsing. When the super empath withdraws completely, the narcissist does not merely lose a person, they lose an internal reference system they never knew how to build for themselves. This obsession does not function like longing. It is not soft, not nostalgic, not purely emotional. It functions like a system error. The narcissist begins to experience strange moments: emptiness appearing even while in a new relationship, anxiety with no clear source, restlessness when no one can read their inner state, and most of all, a sense that something used to make everything easier, but now it's gone. This happens because the super empath did not only serve an emotional role, they were a reality filter. They helped the narcissist interpret the world, interpret the relationship, interpret themselves in the least threatening way. When that filter disappears, the narcissist is forced to face raw reality, and that is not something they are built to endure for long. Here a crucial paradox emerges. The narcissist may publicly deny the super empath's value, even belittle, smear, or replace them quickly. But at a deeper level of the mind, the imprint the super empath left cannot be overwritten. Because it is not the memory of a person, it is the memory of a rare state of stability the narcissist once experienced in their presence. Each time the narcissist enters a new relationship, they unconsciously search for that structure again. But what they fail to recognize is that not everyone has the capacity to hold, regulate, and mirror the way a super empath can. New relationships may provide stimulation, admiration, even power, but they lack stabilizing depth. And that absence becomes a constant trigger. The obsession becomes clearest in silence. Not when they are lonely, but when they are successful, when everything should be fine, yet inside there is an unsettling echo. It wasn't this tense before. This is the moment the narcissist begins to compare, not consciously, but through sensation. And the super empath becomes an invisible standard no one can surpass. From a Jungian lens, this is a phenomenon of projection inversion. The narcissist once projected their shadow onto the super empath so it could be regulated. When the super empath disappears, the shadow no longer has a refuge, and the mind turns back, searching for the object that once contained it. Not to love, but to discharge accumulated pressure. But because that object no longer participates, the pressure only builds. This is why the narcissist often experiences obsession in cycles. There are periods when they appear indifferent, even confident that they have moved on. But then, at times of stress, failure, or when someone stops reflecting them positively, the image of the super empath returns like a faint shadow, not clear, not specific, but enough to disrupt the entire emotional system. More importantly, this obsession does not lead to maturity, it leads to repetition. The narcissist tries to recreate the old structure through new means: more control, more refined manipulation, greater demands for the new partner's presence. But the more they attempt to recreate it, the more they expose the dependency that had previously been concealed by the super empath. Meanwhile, the super empath, having restructured the ego, leaves no opening for return. Not because they resist, but because their new system no longer contains a point of compatibility. This places the narcissist in a psychologically dangerous position. The object of obsession cannot be accessed, cannot be activated, cannot be pulled back into the old game. At this point, the obsession shifts from outward to inward. The narcissist begins to doubt their own capacity, not consciously, but at the instinctive level. Why does everything collapse when that person isn't there? This question is not answered, because answering it would force them to touch the hollow core within themselves. Part 8. The final silence. When the super empath no longer participates in the old reality. The super empath's silence is not a tactic, and it is not a reaction. It is the natural consequence of a system that has completed withdrawal. When the super empath is silent, it does not mean they are trying to influence the narcissist. On the contrary, it means the narcissist no longer exists as a variable inside their inner structure. Before, the super empath's presence always came with movement, adjusting, responding, explaining, soothing, keeping rhythm. Silence in that phase was once considered dangerous, because it could make everything feel out of control. But after restructuring, the super empath arrives at a foundational realization. Not all chaos needs to be held, and not all collapse needs to be prevented. This silence carries no oppositional energy. It contains no anger, no challenge, no hidden message. It is the absence of intervention. And it is precisely that absence that exposes the distorted mechanism that was previously covered by the super empath's presence. To the narcissist, this silence is not received as normal, because they are not structured to exist in a space without feedback. In the narcissist system, everything requires reaction to confirm the ego's existence. When reaction disappears, they do not know where they stand in the power order. But the super empath no longer cares about that order. The key point here is this: the super empath's silence is not merely not speaking. It is no longer speaking from the old position. They no longer stand in the role of the explainer, the regulator, the one responsible for another person's stability. They have withdrawn from the stage where the narcissist once needed an audience in order to perform the self. Structurally, this is the moment the old loop officially ends. No announcement is required, no dramatic ending is needed. When the super empath is silent, the old system no longer has the energy to continue. The narcissist may try to reactivate the loop in many ways: provocation, hoovering, playing the victim, or pretending to be mature. But all of it collides with a new reality. There is no longer anyone receiving the signal in order to process it. This silence is entirely different from defensive silence or endured silence. It is sovereign silence. Not, I'm not speaking because I'm afraid, but I'm not speaking because there is nothing left to exchange within this structure. When a super empath reaches this state, they do not need to prove their maturity through distance or explanation. Distance appears naturally because there is no longer a point of contact. A subtle but decisive shift occurs inside the super empath. They are no longer curious about the narcissist's outcome. Before, even in pain or awakening, some portion of their energy still moved outward, wanting to understand, wanting to know, wanting certainty that everything was over. At this stage, that curiosity disappears. Not because they are numb, but because the old system is no longer relevant. Silence, therefore, is not closing a door, it is moving into a different room within the same reality. The narcissist can still knock, but the super empath is no longer there to hear it. And this creates a deeply uncomfortable psychological phenomenon for the narcissist. They cannot determine whether they have lost, been abandoned, or been ignored, because there is no confirming signal at all. Meanwhile, for the super empath, silence serves a completely different function. It allows long-term nervous system stabilization. No more hypervigilance. No more preparing to react. No more reading another person. The energy once used to hold order for external chaos is returned to the center, and that return creates a deep steadiness, not exciting, not heightened, but durable. More importantly, silence marks the super empath's release from the moral role. They do not need to be right, to be understood, or to be recognized as the good one or the sacrificial one. When a system has ended, every argument about it becomes unnecessary. And the super empath no longer spends energy on those arguments. Most people who have not reached this stage will mistake silence for weakness, avoidance, or emotional freezing. But in truth, this is a form of silence that appears only after the ego has been fully restructured. Not everyone can be silent in this way, because to do so, you must no longer need the other person to change in order for you to be at peace. Part 9. The death of a system. When no one wins, only reality gets replaced. When the super empath withdraws completely, what ends is not a relationship, but an operating system. That system existed on an unspoken assumption, that there would always be someone willing to regulate, absorb, and keep everything from collapsing. This assumption was never spoken aloud, yet it governed the entire dynamic between the super empath and the narcissist. And when that assumption is withdrawn, the system no longer has the conditions required to continue existing. What matters to understand is this is not a moment of victory. There is no loser and no winner, because this system was not built for mutual growth. It was built for one side to function on behalf of the other. When the super empath stops functioning on behalf of the narcissist, the system does not collapse out of hatred, it collapses from lack of foundation. In the old structure, the super empath served as an invisible stabilizing core. They did not control or command, yet they kept everything from crossing the threshold of breakdown. The narcissist could therefore believe they were standing strong, in charge, controlling reality. But it was borrowed stability, and every borrowed structure shares the same ending. It does not survive when the supply is withdrawn. The death of this system happens quietly. There is no single explosive moment, no marked day. It is like a building still standing, but with no electricity, no water, no structural support. From the outside, everything may look normal, but inside it is dead. And the narcissist is the one who continues living in a space that has lost the ability to sustain itself. This explains why the narcissist often does not collapse immediately. They continue familiar behaviors, finding new supply, building a new image, telling a new story. But they all share one feature. They require more energy, more control, and deliver less effectiveness. Because the old system is no longer supporting them, every attempt to maintain the ego becomes heavier and more fragile. Meanwhile, the super empath does not escape in the sense of winning. They switch systems. Instead of living inside a structure where they must hold order for another person, they step into a structure where order is built from within. This is an ontological difference. And once this system shift is complete, there is no reason to return to the old environment. The super empath does not leave so that the narcissist will learn a lesson. They leave because the old system is no longer compatible with their new structure. Any moral interpretation comes afterward. In psychological reality, this withdrawal is not punitive, it is inevitable. From a Jungian perspective, this is the moment the persona is no longer being upheld by another. The narcissist is forced to face the emptiness behind the mask, not to heal, but to realize that no one is standing behind it to hold it up anymore. And the super empath, having completed the integration of their own shadow, is no longer pulled into the rescuer role, a role that was itself the shadow of compassion without discernment. The death of this system does not create justice in an emotional sense. It creates a replacement of reality, one reality in which the narcissist continues to exist, but with fewer anchors, less stability, and increasing dependence on external structures, and another reality in which the super empath lives with less drama, fewer bindings, but greater sovereignty. And here is the key point. The old system cannot be repaired because it was built on a foundational imbalance. There is no better version of it, only the version that ends. The super empath does not carry that system with them when they leave. They let it die where it stands. Once this is understood, questions like who was right, who was wrong, who won, who lost become irrelevant. Those questions belong to the old system where everything had to be defined by reaction. In the new system, there is only one criterion left: the sustainability of the inner structure. Part 10, outside the old world. When the super empath no longer lives inside structures that need them to survive. After the old system dies, the super empath does not move on in a linear sense. They exit a kind of reality. That reality is not only tied to the narcissist, but tied to all the invisible structures that once operated by requiring them to keep others stable. And here, a rarely discussed yet decisive phase begins, the phase of living outside the role. At this stage, the super empath no longer defines themselves through relationship, conflict, or social function. They do not seek connection to compensate, and they are no longer drawn to environments with high emotional noise. This creates a strange sensation. The world no longer pulls them in as it once did. Not because the world changed, but because they are no longer compatible with structures that run on emotional distortion. One of the clearest signs of this phase is a shift in how the super empath experiences time. Previously, their time was often fragmented, always something to handle, a state to regulate, another person's emotions to read. Now, time becomes continuous, not because life contains fewer tasks, but because the invisible interruptions of holding someone else's system are gone. In this space, the super empath begins to realize that many norms they once believed were natural actually existed only inside dependent structures. For example, the idea that love must come with sacrifice, that maturity means enduring, that leaving equals failure. Once they leave the old world, these ideas lose their pull. They are no longer true, but they also do not need to be argued against. They simply no longer belong to the reality the super empath now inhabits. A deeper change occurs at the level of perception. The super empath no longer responds to disorder with the instinct to repair. When they witness instability, they can see it clearly, often more clearly than before, but they no longer feel personally summoned to intervene. This is a major turning point, because it marks the end of identification between awareness and responsibility. Seeing no longer means carrying. This makes the super empath seem hard to predict to others. They are no longer easily pulled by collective emotion, no longer triggered by crisis, and no longer reacting according to familiar scripts. Not because they are indifferent, but because they have shifted into a different coordinate system, one where stability does not come from controlling the external environment. At this stage, the super empath also begins redefining connection. Instead of connection based on need, they allow only relationships that are existentially symmetrical. They do not need to be perfect, but they must be capable of standing on their own. Such relationships are fewer, but they do not drain. They do not require continuous effort to sustain. They exist because neither side needs to use the other to patch an inner lack. One important point that is often misunderstood: this phase does not bring a sense of elevation. It brings stillness, and this stillness can feel uncomfortable to those accustomed to intensity. But for the super empath, this is the first state in life in which they do not have to adjust themselves to fit the instability of the environment. It is within this stillness that the super empath begins to develop a new kind of strength, the ability to be present without intervening. They can be in another person's space without being pulled into their dynamics. They can listen without absorbing. They can understand without dissolving. This is not a learned skill, it is the direct result of fully withdrawing from parasitic structures. Part 11, the irreversible shift. When the super empath can no longer return to who they used to be. After everything, what truly changes when a super empath is betrayed does not lie in the narcissist's story, nor in the outcome of the relationship. What changes is the very structure of the super empath's existence. And once that structure has shifted, there is no path back, not because of hatred, but because the old reality no longer fits their new form. This change is not emotional in nature. It is not loud, dramatic, or in need of announcement. It unfolds like a foundational update to a psychological operating system. Previously, the super empath functioned on an unspoken premise that if they understood enough, held enough, loved enough, chaos could be controlled. Betrayal shattered that premise, not through pain, but through structural truth. There are systems that cannot be saved, only exited. From this moment on, the super empath no longer places themselves in situations that require proof through sacrifice. They no longer need anyone to fully understand their story in order to move forward, because what they left was not a person, but a mode of existence. And once that mode has been identified, it cannot be unconsciously lived again. The irreversibility lies here. The super empath has seen their role within the old system and has seen the cost required to maintain it. Once this awareness is integrated, it cannot be forgotten. Every promise, apology, or display of change afterward is read through a new layer of perception, one in which structure matters more than words and trajectory matters more than momentary emotion. This creates a kind of non-negotiable ending. There is no dialogue that can reopen it, no script that can repair it. Not because the super empath has closed a door, but because that door no longer leads anywhere. The reality behind it has been dismantled. While the narcissist continues searching for ways to recreate the old order through new people, new power, new images, the super empath no longer lives within the logic of reconstruction. They do not rebuild from ruins. They move onto a different plane where stability does not depend on being needed. And this is what makes the change so complete. The super empath does not become higher, better, or stronger in the conventional sense. They become incompatible with structures that operate through distortion. This is not an achievement. It is the natural consequence of having exited a role that lasted too long. At this stage, the super empath no longer needs to protect themselves through vigilance. They no longer need to maintain distance through control. The irreversibility shows itself here. They are no longer drawn to places that would require them to become the holder, not because they resist, but because their nervous system no longer recognizes that as home. What outsiders often misunderstand is assuming the super empath has frozen, grown cold, or lost the ability to love deeply. The reality is the opposite. They simply no longer love within structures that require them to disappear in order to maintain connection. Love, for them now, is no longer tied to function. It is tied to the parallel presence of two independent subjects. And so, when we return to the title, They betrayed a super empath and everything changed. Everything does not refer to punishment, collapse, or the other person's tragedy. Everything refers to one thing only. The super empath no longer lives in a world where betrayal can be repaired by trying harder. No revenge takes place. No emotional justice is distributed. There is only a cold truth. When the stabilizing force withdraws, the system that depended on it either matures on its own or dissolves on its own. The super empath does not stay to watch which outcome occurs. They do not need to know, because the change has already completed itself within them. And once this change occurs, there is no what if, no if only, no this time is different. Not because their heart has closed, but because they have returned to their correct position within reality, where they no longer exist to keep someone else's world from collapsing. That is the irreversible change. Not because of injury, not because of hatred, but because awareness has completed its function. Part 12, no going back. When a truth has been seen. If you've stayed with this video until now, you've likely realized something important. This story was never truly about the narcissist. They were only the context. What has been examined from beginning to end is the moment a person realizes they have lived too long in the role of holding someone else's world together. The super empath does not awaken through victory. They awaken through withdrawal. And that withdrawal is not escape. It is the ending of a long-standing confusion. The confusion between love and responsibility, between empathy and carrying, between presence and self-erasure. The most important thing to take away is not knowledge, not psychological terminology, and not the comfort of believing that you are stronger than them. The most important thing is a cold but liberating truth. You were never born to be the stabilizing system for an ego that refuses to mature. When the super empath withdraws, they do not carry resentment with them. They carry inner precision. They know exactly what no longer belongs to them. And when a person knows that with clarity, all forms of manipulation lose their power, not because the person has stronger defenses, but because there is no longer a point of contact. If there is an ending to this story, it is not the image of the narcissist collapsing or feeling remorse. It is the image of the super empath no longer needing to look back. Not because they forget, but because memory no longer holds structural power. It becomes data, no longer the engine of life. And this is where we need to stop today, not to make you feel better, but to help you see more clearly. Because once you see how a system operates, how you were pulled in, how you were kept there, and how you unknowingly sustained it, you cannot return to living as you did before. If this video helps you realize that your silence is not weakness, that not returning is not failure, and that stopping the rescue is not coldness, then you did not watch in vain. If these analyses touch something you once felt but could not name, consider subscribing to the channel, not to find quick answers, but to continue dismantling the psychological illusions we were taught to call love, responsibility, or maturity. Is IT's and will. And if you are currently in the phase of withdrawal, remember this. When you stop holding on, the world does not collapse. Only the systems that were never stable disappear. Part 13, no going back. When a truth has been seen, if you have stayed with this video until here, then you have likely realized something as well. This story was never truly about the narcissist. They were only the context. What has been examined from beginning to end is the moment a person realizes they have lived too long in the role of keeping someone else's world from collapsing. The super empath does not awaken through victory. They awaken through withdrawal. And that withdrawal is not escape, but the end of a long-standing confusion between love and responsibility, between empathy and carrying, between presence and self-erasure. The most important thing to take away is not knowledge, not psychological terminology, and not the comfort of thinking you are stronger than them. The most important thing is a cold but liberating truth. You were never born to become the stabilizing system for an ego unwilling to mature. When the super empath withdraws, they do not carry resentment with them. They carry inner precision. They know exactly what is no longer theirs. And when a person knows that with precision, all forms of manipulation lose their power, not because they resist better, but because there is no longer a point of contact. If there is an ending to this story, it is not the image of the narcissist collapsing or feeling remorse. It is the image of the super empath no longer needing to look back. Not because they forgot, but because memory no longer holds structural power. It is only data. It is no longer a driving force. And this is where we need to stop today. Not to make you feel better, but to help you see more clearly. Because once you have seen how a system operates, how you were pulled in, how you were kept, and how you yourself sustained it, you cannot return to living the same way again. If this video helps you realize that your silence is not weakness, that not returning is not failure, and that stopping the rescue is not cruelty, then you have not watched in vain. If you feel these analyses touched something you once could not name, consider subscribing to the channel, not to find quick answers, but to continue dismantling the psychological illusions we have been taught to call love, responsibility, or maturity. Is radiant. And if you are in the stage of withdrawal, remember this: when you stop holding, the world does not collapse. Only the systems that were never stable to begin with disappear. Part 14, After Everything Has Ended, where the super empath stands in this world. After all old structures have dissolved, after silence has completed its function, after there is nothing left to return to or repair, a quiet question emerges, not for the narcissist, but for the super empath themselves. What do I exist for if I am no longer holding someone else together? The answer does not arrive as a new mission, nor as a higher role. It comes as a simple but fundamental recognition. The super empath does not exist to maintain order for chaos, but to live within their own order. Before, that order was sacrificed to preserve external balance. Now, it becomes the only anchor. From this new position, the super empath is no longer special in the sense of being pulled out of ordinary life. They do not withdraw from the world. On the contrary, they step into it with a different quality of presence, presence without burden. This makes them no longer drawn into the loud centers of drama, yet it does not make them distant or cold. A subtle but decisive shift occurs. The super empath no longer needs validation through being needed by others. This completely changes how they participate in society, work, and relationships. They no longer enter to stabilize systems, but to contribute where there is compatibility, and to withdraw when there is not. From here, the super empath often becomes a form of presence that is difficult to categorize. Not a leader in the sense of control, not a healer in the sense of rescue, and not an outsider. They are someone no longer pulled by structures built on lack, and for that very reason, their presence, even in silence, becomes shaping. What must be emphasized is this: this stage does not make the super empath morally superior or detached from humanity. They still feel, still understand, still empathize. But empathy no longer requires self-sacrifice. It stops at the right place. And the ability to stop at the right place is the clearest sign that psychological maturity has been completed. In a world where many systems are built on someone carrying what others cannot, the super empath in this new state becomes a living paradox. They do not oppose the system. They do not serve it either. They simply are no longer compatible. And this incompatibility, over time, exposes the weaknesses of distorted structures without any need for criticism. If there is a true legacy of this journey, it is not wisdom, nor the ability to read people better. It is the right to exist without bearing the consequences of other people's lack of maturity. A very basic right, but one that is often reclaimed only after loss. The super empath does not need a new story to go on living. They only need not to return to the old one. From here on, every step is a choice, not a reflex. Every presence carries sovereignty, and every withdrawal carries no guilt. This is not a beautiful ending. It is a correct one. After everything that has been unpacked, one truth cannot be avoided. This story was never about who betrayed whom or who paid what price. It is the story of an existing structure that reached its limit. And when that limit is reached, there is no room left for negotiation, repair, or return. The super empath does not leave to punish. They leave because they can no longer live inside a system that requires them to erase themselves in order to maintain stability for others. Once this awareness fully forms, it cannot be reversed, not because the wound is too deep to forgive, but because the old reality is no longer compatible with their new structure. What collapses after that withdrawal is not love, nor the relationship itself. What collapses is the illusion that someone can live by relying on another person to always hold them together. When this illusion disappears, every system that depended on it must bear its own gravity. And the most important thing that must be said plainly, the super empath has no obligation to stay and witness that outcome. Other people's growth is not their responsibility. The collapse of an unsustainable system is not their fault. Withdrawal, in this case, is not failure. It is the only remaining form of alignment with truth. If there is one thing you should carry with you after this video, it is this. You do not lose your value when you stop holding others together. You do not become cold when you do not return. And you are not selfish for refusing to continue living inside structures that require you to pay with yourself. When the super empath withdraws their hands, the world does not end. Only the systems that could never stand on their own disappear. And that is not a tragedy. It is reality